Hi, everybody. So welcome to all the freshmen and facts and all the other students who are joining us today. We're so very happy to have you here. My name is Monica Butiani, and I am one of the two co-chairs of the first-year Advisory Counselor Program. I am attorney senior, I'm a biology major, and I'm from Winter Haven, Florida. And with me here today, I have Jillian Williams, who is going to tell you a little bit about herself.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the class of 2015. Again, my name is Jillian Williams, and I am a sophomore this year at Duke, hailing from Troy, Michigan. Any Midwesterners out there? There we go. Just this past year, I sat in your seats and then suddenly found myself on the very committee that selected Eating Animals as your summer reading book. One of the first things we want to talk about is the summer reading committee itself, who we are, what we do, how we came to choose this book, and then finally why. So last year, the committee was composed of students, faculty, and administration from both the University of North Carolina and Duke University's campuses. Some of those committee members from UNC are actually here with us today, and since we haven't seen them since last spring, I'd like to take a moment and thank them and let them know just how pleased we are that they could join us. Now, the committee began its selection process by reviewing over 100 nominations. In order to do this, each committee member took the time to read each one and then bring their thoughts on the book back to meetings. Of the numerous meetings that were held, I can tell you that some books were let go rather quickly, while others were, well, fought out. What I found as the youngest member of the committee was that students' input was valued the most. This speaks to Duke's commitment to choosing a book that its students know will resonate with their peers. As a committee, the joint collaboration between Duke and UNC was a chance for the class of 2015 on both campuses to connect with each other through intellectual discussion and debate. One of the things that I found striking about the book was the plethora of perspectives. We hope that this book would inspire people to share their own perspectives, as well as the life experience that shaped them. Foer shows us that it is impossible to talk about food without bringing in one's personal history. The sharing of that history is what allows us to bond with one another. We hoped it would challenge your thinking and bring light to an issue that is not widely discussed in the community. We found the author compelling, and his personality, his commitment to family, his ethics, and his very nature to shine through in the book. We hope that you enjoyed it and that you enjoy your years here at Duke. Monica Butiani.
Equally important is what the committee did see in this book is what they did not see in this book. To be clear, they did not see this book as a chance to convert each and every individual in your class to a vegetarian or a vegan, nor, as suggested by some of your classmates in the discussion on the Class of 2015 Facebook page, was the book a selection of secret plot by the administration to save money on food costs. Ultimately, whatever your sentiments about the book's content, agree or disagree, passionate or apathetic, we hope that you will learn something from this experience and engage with each other in a positive way. And now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the author of this year's summer reading selection for the Duke class of 2015. He is the author of Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, and Everything is Illuminated, and has won numerous awards for his work. He will be touring all over the country to talk about eating animals, and today we are very lucky to have him here to speak to all of you. Additionally, we have the amazing opportunity to live stream this session and thus have alumni and friends of the university from around the world joining us in today's conversation as well. So please join me in welcoming Jonathan Safran Foer.
What's that? What did you say? I said thanks so much. Thank you. You know, whenever somebody says it was not a secret plot, it was always a secret plot. Have you ever noticed that? Nobody ever says it unless it was actually a secret plot. But there are worse secret plots that a university could enact. So I want to thank you for having me here. I have to thank the book selection committee in particular, and I think that it says something very, very powerful about the school that you've chosen to go to and the school that's accepted you, that they would choose this book to give out to freshmen. I have no idea, but I feel fairly certain that at least the great majority of people who are on the selection committee were not vegetarians. And I'm getting a nod of confirmation on the side. It's a very, very bold choice, and I'm not saying anything about my book when I say that. I'm saying something about the subject. It's simply a hard thing to talk about, and it's something that is much easier and more comfortable to avoid. And most people find it absolutely possible and easy to avoid. And that a university would say, this is who we are, this is what we're going to ask you all, this is going to be your initiation into your college education, to encounter something that's difficult, that might strain your mind in any number of ways, might challenge you to question where you come from, your familial traditions, maybe your religion, with the hope not of agreeing on some conclusion, as was said in the introduction, but the hope of asking really provocative questions, because that's the point of college, or it should be the point of college, and I don't frankly think it is in most cases, and that's why I'm making a point of talking about it now and here. Is it seems to me the point is to ask the biggest questions in the most open-eyed and honest way, and I just feel very grateful to be a part of it and very honored. I'm also excited to be here because I'm frankly just so jealous of you. I would give anything to be sitting where you're sitting instead of standing where I'm standing. You're on the verge of what should be the most transformative period of your life, really. And if it's not, you're making a mistake. There are different ways to move through college, and I think that you guys have certain burdens that I didn't have when I went to college. When I graduated in '99, people were just beginning to use the internet. I remember I had a roommate, a math major, who was all the time on his computer, and I went in one day, I said, "What do you do on that thing? Like, how are you spending so much time on your computer? What's to do?" And it seems like such a totally stupid question now, when the more obvious question is, what do you do off your computer? But my only point is, when I was in college, we didn't have Facebook, and we didn't have Twitter, and we didn't have Google, I don't think. And there are good things about all of those technologies, and screens can offer a lot, but I hope for you that your college years will be very, what in the art world they call site-specific, that it can only happen here and it can only happen with the people that you're around. And the problem with spending a lot of time on screens is you're kind of nowhere and you're kind of with nobody. And that can be really fun and it can be really useful, and it can be intellectually stimulating, but it is not as fun, useful, or stimulating as being people that surround you. So I really hope that you are as present for this as you can be. And I wish, as I said, I wish that I were in your position. The last reason I think I want to say before I start talking is that I'm excited to be speaking to a young audience. It's been very well documented that young people are not only more capable of change than older people, but crave change more than older people. And there's actually a pretty direct relationship between how old you are and how difficult to change, how difficult change comes. And it makes common sense if you think about it, because the older you get, the more ingrained your habits are, and the more ritualized your life is. And it's like a car going at a faster speed. It's harder to slow down. But you are sort of in the prime of your change. In the general population, 4 to 6% in America describe themselves as vegetarian. On American college campuses, it's 18%. There are more vegetarians on American college campuses than Catholics. Now, I mentioned this not to say something about the prevalence of vegetarianism. That's really not the point. The reason I say it is because it has to do with the prevalence of idealism and romanticism, and this idea that you're not stuck with the world that you're given, and you're not stuck with the identity that you've developed to this point, and that if you want to do something different, you can. And if you want to say no, whether it's to a teacher or to a friend or family member or to a social norm, a cultural norm, you can say no. And not only can you say no, but you can say no in such a way that other people want to say no with you. And you can say no in such a way that it feels more like saying yes than saying no, and really change the world. So, one thing I imagine we'll end up touching on in one capacity or another today is, what does it matter what any individual eats? 50 billion farm animals are factory farmed every year. This is one of the, it's an industry that is so gigantic, it's hard even to wrap one's head around. What does it even matter what one person does? Well, I think college students believe and know better than anybody else that it matters what one person does. And also that there's a very real sense in which there's no such thing as one person. You never do anything alone, or there are very few things that you do alone. You probably go to the bathroom alone. But when you buy food in a supermarket or in a restaurant, when you consume food, you're almost always part of a large web, a large connected web of causes and effects. People hear what you do, people see what you do, and even when you don't know it, maybe even especially when you don't know it, you're influencing other people. So this is a subject that I think is not actually all that well served by a lecture. And I tried to fashion my book to make it more like a conversation than one person talking to readers. So there are lots of different voices in it. There are lots of different stories that mingle. And I did that not only because maybe it's more accessible or engaging or entertaining, but I also just think it's true. Food has to do with calories and energy, but obviously it's a lot more than that. Food has to do with argument and philosophy and facts, but obviously it's a lot more than that, as evidenced by the fact that so many incredibly smart philosophical people still eat factory farm meat all the time. Obviously there's something else going on, and I think the something else is just the messiness of being a human. Who are your grandparents? Who are your parents? What are the values that they transmitted? What kind of stories were told to you? What kind of stories do you tell about yourself? So ideally, I will spend a little bit of time talking about a few issues, but then we'll leave a good chunk of time just to speak with one another. So the question of eating animals is often thought of as being very controversial. I imagine that when you found out that you had to read a book called Eating Animals, at least a lot of you thought, do I really have to? Is that really something that I want to do? Is this going to be a drag? Is this going to be scary or violent? And I don't blame you. It is a difficult subject. Many times in bookstores, I've seen people take my book off a shelf from a distance and look at it, and maybe their curiosity is piqued, and then they turn it around and they read the description of the book. And I see that moment when the sort of cloud comes over their head, and they think, is this really how I want to spend my limited amount of free time? Like, am I going to read this in bed at the end of a long day of work? Am I supposed to take this on the plane? I don't blame them. I don't blame them because there is an inherent violence in the subject. It is a bloody subject that has nothing to do with what's right and wrong. It's just a quality of the subject. But also, I think, some of the hesitancy has to do with the ways that meat is often talked about. And despite how central it is to our lives, it's almost never talked about. Usually, the conversation is directed, or at least this has been true until pretty recently, the conversation about meat is directed by animal activists. And sometimes that conversation has a tone of finger wagging, or holier than thou, or do you realize what you're eating? That kind of thing. And nobody, myself included, wants to be addressed that way. And so maybe we've come to believe that that's the only way to talk about it, and so we turn ourselves off. But it's interesting because it's a subject that has become almost taboo, and even the most moral and moralizing people, even philosophers, even religious leaders, all of whom would seem to have a real vested interest in this subject, seem not to want to go near it. And I think that part of the problem is in how the question is framed, if we're asking the right question in the first place, and if we're framing the question in an appropriate way, in a generous way. So if I were to ask, it's probably not going to work with this audience because you're here, and because at least some of you have read this book. But if I were to ask, let's say, 100 Americans, pulled at random, from Berkeley to, rural Arkansas, an 80-year-old and a 15-year-old, every race, every religion, the most diverse group we could assemble. If I were to ask those 100 people, do you think it's right to kill animals for food? Probably about 96 of them would say yes, it's right. There's absolutely nothing problematic with it. Now, if I were to ask the same 100 people, do you think it's right to have a farm system that is unnecessarily the #1 cause of global warming? And this is not a PETA statistic. This is a United Nations statistic, among many other sources. A farm that is, according to the United Nations, one of the top 2 or 3 causes of every significant environmental problem on the planet, locally and globally: air pollution, water pollution, deforestation, loss of biodiversity. I'm sure that those same 96 people would say, no, that's not a good system. Maybe some would be outraged, maybe some would just think it was regrettable, but there'd be a very, very broad consensus that we need to change it. It's not right. And similarly, in terms of animal welfare, even though you might think that it's perfectly fine, in theory, to kill an animal for food, it's a very different proposition to ask, is it right to, for example, keep a pregnant pig in a cage so small that she can't turn around for the duration of her pregnancy? Is it right to treat farmed animals in ways that would be illegal if they were other kinds of animals, like dogs or cats? And you would find that there was a very broad consensus saying that that was wrong. 96% of Americans have said that they think animals deserve legal protection from cruelty. And 76% of Americans say that farm animals, not just dogs and cats, but farm animals, deserve strict legal protection, not just legal protection from cruelty. So we're in this sort of odd position where we pretty much all agree that how we treat animals matters. There's a lot of disagreement about the particulars, but we pretty much all agree that it matters. And we pretty much all agree that the environment matters. You'd be hard-pressed to find somebody who to air pollution or water pollution. We would say that person is outside relationship to animals and to the environment. In front of us, on our plate, we find it very, very hard to talk about, and very hard to care about, and very hard to act on. So I think part of the reason for this is there's a kind of false dichotomy has been set up between caring and not caring. Like, those are the two options. And this is largely, I think, because of actually the word vegetarian. There isn't a word for what it means to care about these things without being a vegetarian. You're either somebody who doesn't eat meat, or you're somebody who does eat meat. You're either somebody who recognizes that this is a huge problem in the world and is doing what he or she can to work toward a solution, or not. But there's nothing else. And the problem is it has completely erased the middle space that I think most people want to occupy, because I think most people, when they learn about factory farming, care about it. I also think most people aren't going to become vegetarians anytime soon. They don't want to, they're not ready to. So what do? Do we just say, oh well, there's nothing to do? Or do we try to find ways to expand that middle space and give people a way to care and to act on their concern without being hypocritical? in a way, hypocrisy is at the heart of the problem. You've probably, I don't know if you've ever encountered this yourself or witnessed it, but very often, you're in a situation with two people, let's say at a dining hall, and person A fills the tray, and person B says, "Oh, aren't you going to get the hamburger?" And person A says, "No, I'm actually a vegetarian." And then person B says, "But you wear leather shoes," or "But I saw you swat a fly, earlier." Something, reaching for the hypocrisy, but you're not completely, perfectly what you claim to be. And it's the strangest. We would never apply that model to any other ethical decision. I mean, imagine if, I try to tell the truth, right? It's somewhat important to me. My wife, we're getting ready to go to a party. My wife comes down, says, "Do you like this dress?" I say, "Yeah." But let's say it's actually not my favorite dress. I just said it to maintain peace. That doesn't mean that I then go and tell a lie at every available opportunity. It just means I'm somebody who tries to tell the truth, who every now and then might tell a white lie. Or maybe a better analogy is with environmentalism. Most of us care about the environment. I try to buy good, efficient appliances. I use those light bulbs that last a long time. I turn lights off when I leave a room. I don't leave a car idling. But I also flew here from New York this morning, and I know that in terms of my transportational footprint, flying is like the worst thing that I can do. But it's not like I got off the plane and called home and said, "Go turn on the car and turn on the lights and open the refrigerator." That's crazy. It doesn't make any sense. But that's the standard we apply to food. I've met so many vegetarians, ex-vegetarians, who say, I was a vegetarian for 4 years. And I'll say, "What happened?" I'll say, "Well, it was 11:30 at night, and I was making a connection in an airport, and the only food that was available was a Kentucky Fried Chicken, and I was starving, so I had some chicken." And I'll say, "And then what?" And they'll say, that was the end of my vegetarianism. As if, the breach requires you to throw your hands up in the air and say, "Now it's completely over. I can't do it anymore." So I think the problem is we're so afraid of being hypocritical, or being seen as hypocritical, that we'd rather not try at all. That we would literally rather choose a kind of complete ignorance or complete lack of will or lack of effort or blindness instead of effort. And so what I wanted to do with my book, and I'm glad that you mentioned this in the introduction, was not convert the world to vegetarianism. Would I be happy if that happened? Sure, but it's not going to happen. It's not even going to come close to happening. But what I do think we are on the verge of having happen is a great expansion of this middle ground, so that there suddenly becomes a place for people who want to care about these things, but aren't going to become vegetarian, people who want to continue to eat meat, but also care about the environment and care about animals and care about human health and care about rural communities and care about farming, care about our continued ability to use antibiotics. So, because it's a controversial issue, I was quite concerned before the book came out. I just did not know how it was going to be received. In fact, I had a conversation with a food writer, quite a prominent food writer, who said, first of all, you should get a lawyer. I'd have a lawyer read your book, because the factory farm industry is famously litigious and aggressive, and just be protected. And he also said, you might consider even having a bodyguard, because he had had several experiences where he felt someone came up to him aggressively. So I am the kind of person who finds it impossible not to think about such things once they've been put in my mind. And I would play out all sorts of fantasies about what was going to happen at my first reading. My first reading happened to be in New York. With somebody going to, as I imagined it, like throw a big piece of meat at me while I was doing the reading. And then I even imagined a Barnes & Noble security guard going up to that person and saying all right, let's get out of here. And my saying, no, leave the person, and then inviting the person to come up on the stage, and then somehow decimating him mentally, just really making him very, very small. It was always a he, by the way, in these imaginings. There was never a woman. A woman wouldn't do that. And in fact, none of that happened. I've spoken in many, many different kinds of places to many different audiences. I've spoken in liberal hotbeds like Berkeley, and I've spoken in farming communities like Dowagiac, Michigan. I've spoken to liberal audiences and conservative audiences, to younger audiences like this, to older audiences, to inner city public schools. I've been to all kinds of places. And what I found is there is a very broad consensus that, in fact, almost everybody agrees about almost everything. And that the challenge is to find good ways of talking about it and empowering ways of acting on our concern. If you say to somebody, do you think meat is murder? You're going to get nowhere. Or rather, you'll get a great distance with very few people. PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, has probably been the most successful advocacy group of any kind in American history. But they have a particular strategy, which is, let's make 1 out of 5 people very passionate, even if it's at the expense of 4 out of 5 people. And that's taken them a great distance. The problem is they lose 4 out of 5 people. And if you really care about these things, not as a lifestyle issue, not as an identity issue, but because of the way that it affects our world, the way that it affects the environment and animals and human health, there needs to be a strategy that engages those 4 out of 5 people. And I think when you try to talk about these things in a calm, conversational way that is open to other people's opinions and experiences, you find, or I have found, that that people really agree. And what they agree on is that we need a different system. We used to have a system that worked very, very well, where the country was filled with many more farmers, small farmers, family farmers, that were looking to nature as a guide, as a role model. Nature has incredibly elegant and incredibly efficient systems. Factory farming, which developed about 70 or 80 years ago, but in earnest maybe 50 years ago, looks to nature as an obstacle to be overcome. So instead of allowing the sun to signal to animals when they should wake up or when they should go to sleep, animals are kept indoors with artificial lighting so we can speed up light cycles. Instead of having healthy animals as the ultimate concern, it's profitable animals, which are often ill. In fact, these animals are destined to be ill because of the way that they've been bred, which is why they're fed antibiotics from birth until death. We give 7 times the amount of antibiotics to healthy animals, animals that aren't sick, as we do to sick humans. And the Center for Disease Control and the Union of Concerned Scientists has been pleading with the animal agriculture industry for years to stop this, because we know it's making them less effective for us. These are drugs that we depend on. Environmental destruction is built into the business model, whereas it used to be environmental sustainability. There are companies like Smithfield that had 7,000 violations of the Clean Water Act in 1 year. If they'd had 50, we would say, that's bad. If they'd had 200, we would say, wow, shame on them. Somebody has to keep a better eye on them. But 7,000 really starts to sound like a plan. It starts to sound like it's on purpose. It starts to sound like a company that's getting away with everything that we allow them to get away with. And unfortunately, we've allowed them to get away with everything. So this new kind of farming that I'm describing, factory farming, is now produces 99% of all of the animals that are sold in supermarkets and grocery stores. If that 1%, those small and family farms, which are in just about every conceivable way the antithesis of factory farming, were still the norm in America, I wouldn't have written my book. I don't think I would eat that meat, and there are complicated reasons why, and they're very personal, and I wouldn't make any effort to persuade you of my way of thinking. But unfortunately, they are now the tiniest sliver of what's available. And if you're eating meat that's sold in a supermarket, and you're eating meat from a restaurant, if you are not actively seeking out these alternatives, maybe at a green market or through a CSA, then you can feel very confident that you're eating this factory farm meat. So one of the reasons why we allow this to happen, despite the fact that we agree we don't want it, is because we're being fooled. Think about the labels in the supermarket on meat and on eggs. They are of windowless sheds. Excuse me, they are never of windowless sheds. They're of pasture and animals on grass and farmers and sunshine, the kinds of things that we respect and respond to. You know, when we think about farming, that's what we think about. If I were to say, give me 10 words that you think about when you think about animal farming, I think most people would say grass, sunshine, hay, stuff like that. And these things have nothing to do with most farming anymore. But we're being manipulated by language, and we're being manipulated by pictures. And one of the other goals of my book was to try, in my own way, to correct that, so that the images that we hold in our mind corresponds to what it is that we're being sold and to what we're consuming. Because I guess I'm convinced, and I'm more convinced now than when I wrote the book, that when people are confronted with that reality, they don't really need any more persuading. You know, this is a very special problem in the world. I think it's on scale with the biggest problems in the world. And yet, unlike those, it doesn't require a massive solution. It requires a very local solution. We don't have to go to war with another country. We don't have to spend trillions of dollars. We don't have to elect a new government. And we don't even need to find new values. The values that we presently have are good. What we need to do is act on our values. And part of that is recognizing what it is that we're being given or what we're being sold. And part of it is just pausing and thinking, is this what I want? How much do I want it? When you're in the supermarket putting food in the cart, to just stop for a second and say, is this really what I want? When you're in a restaurant, stopping for a second and saying, is this really what I want? Or am I ordering it just because it's what I ordered yesterday? Or just because it's what I am used to consuming? One sort of exercise I sometimes ask people to, a mental exercise I ask people to perform is, think about the meals when you really, really enjoy meat, when it really matters. I don't mean like when it tastes good. That's important, but I think we could agree that it's not the most important thing in the world. I mean when it's really a significant thing in your life. So let's say things like Christmas ham, Thanksgiving turkey, any religious occasion that involves meat, any secular holidays like maybe a July 4th barbecue. Let's include birthdays, things like that. Let's include when you go to a really nice restaurant and you know that meat is the specialty. Let's include dinner parties when you're at a friend's house and they have spent a long time preparing something that you don't want to say no to. So if you were to take all of those meals, when you, with full honesty, would say, meat really matters to me here. I know that there's a trade-off, but I'm willing to make it. How many meals would that be a year? You know, if you're being really honest with yourself. I think we could take out all breakfasts. I don't think meat is ever that important at breakfast. Maybe you really like bacon. I know a lot of people really like bacon. That's fine. You don't like bacon infinitely. I know some people are going to say, yes, I do, but those people are, what do you call them? Legacy admissions? When you're only here because you're, oh, what is everybody here legacy? Everybody's upset. My point is, if you really are being like clear-eyed about it and thinking about when this is something that is more significant to you than what you know are the ramifications of eating it, I think most people would end up with a number that's less than 50. I think. But let's just say it's 100. Let's say like 1 out of 3 meals a day, you feel that it is that important to you. Well, that would mean you're not eating meat 200 meals a year. No, excuse me, a lot more than that. 600 meals a year. 400 meals a year? Maybe I was a legacy admission too. 2/3 of the time you're not eating meat. Let's leave it at that. I was a philosophy major. So there is no way in the world that 2/3 of you are going to be vegetarians. simply not going to happen. I do think it's possible that 2/3 of the meals eaten by you guys could not include meat. And so this is the challenge, is when we're thinking about these things, not to think about, I am a vegetarian, I'm not a vegetarian, this is my identity, this is my lifestyle, but instead, these are the things that I care about. I care about the environment. I care about rural communities. I care about animals. I care about human health. And so I'm going to act on that concern, and I'm going to inhabit that middle space, even if it occasionally makes me feel hypocritical. I think I've said enough. There's certainly more I could say. And what would be nice now is to hear your feedback to the book. I always find it nice when somebody says, oh, I changed the way that I eat because of your book, but I find it even nicer when someone really strongly disagrees with me, because that's the point, is to have a really vibrant conversation and to try together to figure these things out. I don't have all the answers. My own eating habits are continuing to change. And often I find myself quite moved by people's personal experiences. I talk to a lot of people who grew up on farms, whose families still farm, and I really do feel grateful to hear such stories and opinions. So I know we have 2 microphones, and last time, classically, it was very hard to find the first person. I did a talk earlier this morning. First person, and then as soon as time was running out, there were like 30 people at each microphone. So I would invite you to come right up.
Hello. Oh, wow, okay. Firstly, I just want to say thank you for coming out here. That's a really good speech. I don't really know if you can answer my question, but I figured you'd be the guy to ask about it. After I read your book, I became a selective omnivore, and I'm pretty concerned with animal welfare. And I know in your book you mentioned that like labels such as organic and cage-free don't usually really mean anything for like the big meat companies like Purdue and stuff. But my question is, can we trust the labels of smaller food companies like Whole Foods, Chipotle, things like that?
Okay, so she said Chipotle, and everybody laughed. I'm curious, why did everybody laugh? Because you assume it's BS?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Chipotle rocks, somebody said. I am actually inclined to agree with you. I think Chipotle is a great company, okay. And they go to extreme lengths to source good food. And they make good food accessible to so many millions of people for whom it otherwise just wouldn't be accessible. They have a higher, as I understand it, food cost to sale price ratio of just about any restaurant of any kind in the country. I think that they're doing really wonderful things, and I so sincerely hope that they're a model for what other fast food or chain food can become. I think Whole Foods is also doing great things. None of these places are perfect, and there's no way that a national chain is going to be perfect. But maybe we should, it's a kind of calculus you have to do for yourself, like how good is good enough for you? So if I were to say to you guys, would you eat an animal if you knew that there was a 1 in 100,000 chance that it was like brutally tortured during its slaughter? Most people would actually say yes. 1 in 100,000 is pretty small. Like we get in cars knowing that there's a greater chance than that we will die in a car. Would you eat it if it was 1 in 10,000, 1 in 100, 1 in 5? These are not, I don't have an answer for you. You have an answer for you. I can tell you that Temple Grandin, who's one of the most important people in the beef industry, did an audit of beef slaughterhouses and found that 1/3 of the time there were deliberate acts of cruelty happening on a regular basis. 1 out of 3 times, not accidents. I mean, who knows how many accidents there are. Accidents must be more regular than deliberate cruelty. There's deliberate cruelty, not happening every now and then, but with regularity. Things have improved since she did that audit. That was probably a low point. But it might not be the worst number to keep in your mind, 1 in 3. So you can change your odds. If you buy organic, it is not the answer, but it's better. You're increasing your odds. If you buy cage-free, it's not the answer, but it's certainly better. So, that's something that you have to sort of, it's a question you have to ask of yourself. Here are the options in front of me. You live in a time when farming has never been more destructive or brutal. You also live in a time when there are more alternatives than ever before. There are so many different kinds of food you can buy. First of all, there's so many kinds of meat you can buy, but there's also so many alternatives to meat. And so you should take all of those choices seriously, knowing that you're not going to get it perfect, but trying to get it more right than you did before.
Hello, my name is Katya, and I'm also really glad that you're here. I actually have two questions. The first one is, as far as I understood, you're a vegetarian, not vegan, right? So I think similar conclusions could be made about veganism that you made about vegetarianism in the book. I mean, products of animal products like milk, cheese, and all the stuff, probably they have similar, probably they affect the environment in similar, like, bad ways that meat consumption does. So why didn't you write about that, and why didn't you become a vegan, and what do you think about veganism, vegetarianism?
So she's asking about veganism as compared to vegetarianism, why I didn't write about it and why I don't practice it. I didn't write about it simply because, well, two reasons. One, I actually didn't know that much about it while I was in the process of writing the book, and it wasn't until I was reasonably far into it that I realized it's exactly the same argument. I mean, in terms of the environment and in terms of animal welfare, it might even be worse. Also, I wanted to write a book that was accessible and that could affect change. And I wanted to sort of cater my argument to those needs. In terms of my own choices, I think veganism is a more ethical way to eat. I don't do it because I'm a hypocrite. I mean, for the reason I said before, like, I find it very difficult, and I wish I had a different answer. It's an embarrassing answer, but I think there's something really powerful in acknowledging our own hypocrisy, as I was saying before. Come back in 4 years and talk to you, I would hope that I would say, I'm a vegan now. It's what I would prefer to be, and I make a lot of choices in that direction. I try not to buy eggs and dairy when I don't know the source. I try to be thoughtful about it, but I do eat it, and I eat it only because it tastes good, and only because it's available, not another reason. So I think, I think if we can move away from these rigid delineations toward questions that were more like, or rather statements of identity maybe, that were more like, I try to eat as few animal products as possible. For me, I eat no meat. For other people, they don't eat meat. There's a great writer named Mark Bittman from the New York Times, a food writer, who is a vegan until 5. And after that, he eats everything. He would eat, tail to eyeballs, everything. And the way he thinks about it is, he cannot ignore the importance of these things. They really, really matter. And yet, he's a foodie. He's like, he writes cookbooks, he's a chef, he reviews food culture, and he's not going to be a vegetarian. So in this weird stance that he's taken, which seems like almost the epitome of hypocrisy, he's eliminated animal products from 2/3 of his meals. It's amazing. So I don't think there's one solution for everybody, and I think that most people are going to be moving toward different solutions throughout their lives, rather than achieving some sort of, final perfection. And I feel like I'm somebody who is also moving in a direction.
Thank you.
Hello. I'm also consider myself a foodie. I like meat. I think it's good. And I kind of wish, Pauline was my grandmother and stuff like that. So I like eating meat a lot. But you presented the very palatable option of perhaps reducing consumption of meat by 2/3 or something like that. And I wish you'd written that actually in your book, because that would have been a really compelling argument. But
The sequel.
Sure, do that. All right. This is perhaps less controversial, but I was wondering what you might think that the agricultural industry might look like were everyone to simply start eating 2/3 less meat, how it might rebound from that.
Well, it's not going to happen suddenly. I mean, it would happen very slowly over time, and what would happen is, if farmers said to me wherever I met them, I don't grow what I want to grow, I grow what I'm asked to grow. So if people were eating less meat, I think that we'd see a great rise in small and family farming, meat that is a much higher quality, that is right now too expensive because of the subsidy structure for factory farming, and also because it's basically an unlevel playing field. But if people were eating a lot less meat, and so were maybe willing to spend more money for each serving of meat, I think we'd see a farm system that probably more closely resembled the one that existed 50 years ago in America. Many more farmers growing many more different kinds of things, a much greater variety of food, and also finding other foods to supplant, the meat that we eat. Americans now eat 180 times as much chicken per person as we did a century ago. It's crazy. It's not just that meat is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, it's that we're eating tons of it. The singular defense of factory farming, the only one they'll ever make, is we feed the world. They don't feed the world, they feed the world cheap meat. Like, there are other ways to feed the world. They have persuaded the world, economically or through manipulative advertising, that we need to eat tons and tons and tons of meat. And it's bad for our health. We know this. This is not my opinion. We know that eating the amounts of meat we currently eat is bad for us. I'm not saying eating meat is bad for us. It's not. If you eat it in a balanced way, it's perfectly good for you. The amount that we eat is bad for us. We know that it's bad for the environment, and we know that it's a nightmare for animals. So I think if we could move back towards something that we had 50 years ago, the only people it would hurt are corporate executives.
All right, thank you.
Hello. First of all, I wanted to thank you very much for your book. I thought it brought a very different perspective to a subject that really needed it in society. But if you think about it, I'd say there's a lot of international societies in which people eat much smaller proportions of meat than people do in America. And I was curious as to why you didn't use those as examples.
It's an excellent point. I mean, Americans eat more meat than, I believe, than anybody else. And factory farming was an American invention. It developed here. It's become a global problem just because it's spread all across Europe. Do you know where there are the most McDonald's per capita, by the way? Anybody know? What city? In Paris. Isn't that amazing? So, factory farming is an international problem, and the real nightmare is it's spreading through India and China, which it's now doing. If the Chinese and Indians start, we will have to factory farm twice as many animals. If everything else holds constant, if the world population doesn't increase, we need to farm 100 billion animals. So I wrote my book primarily for an American audience. I mean, remember that, I didn't say this, but in the book, it began out of a personal inquiry. Like, I just wanted to know what to feed my son, really. So of course I was going to look at the options around me. As it turned out, the book took on a different life at a certain point where I felt like I wanted to share what I was learning and persuade other people that this was an important subject. But the genesis was very, very local, so that was the shape the book took.
Yeah, I just wanted to add though, but do you believe that maybe that in other societies such as India and China that people will not consume as much meat because of different religious and cultural values?
That might have once been true, but it's not going to be true in a few years. I mean, everybody is eating like Americans. Americans export their culture and their habits more effectively than any other country ever has in the history of humankind. So it matters tremendously what Americans eat. In terms of the global marketplace, it matters more what an American eats than what anybody else in the world eats.
Yes. Thank you.
Hi. My father and I had an argument a couple of days after I finished the book. I am a vegetarian, and he's a very happy carnivore. And we were talking about the future, and he asked me, if you have a child, how would you raise this child? And I said, well, with the set of beliefs that I happen to have, I think I would raise it vegetarian. And he became very inflamed and said, that's wrong, because the child has a right to eat meat. And he says that they should be able to choose what they eat, but of course before they're old enough to be of choosing age. It was just interesting to me that he said that they have a right to, and I know that you talk about your son in this book, and how do you feel about that statement that he said?
Well, I don't feel a strong desire to get between you and your father. Let me begin by saying that. I would say two things. One, a child does not have rights of these kinds. Like, a child has a right not to be hit. A child has a right to be, given every opportunity to be healthy. But a child doesn't have a right to eat meat any more than he has a right to eat, let's say, beef, any more than he has a right to eat chimpanzee or the family dog. It just doesn't make any sense. And the choice to raise a child as a vegetarian is no more of a choice than the choice of feeding the child meat. It is exactly the same choice. Just because everybody's doing it doesn't make it less of a choice. Everybody used to smoke in their homes. We would subject children to them. There are plenty of habits that can be prevalent, and later we say, in retrospect, I wish we hadn't done that. I'm not saying I have any problem with somebody raising their kid to eat meat. I truly don't. It's not my business. My only point is, you always raise your child, in the shadow of your values or according to your values. The best parents, I think, are the ones who are most thoughtful about that, even if their values don't necessarily correspond to mine. I really respect thoughtful parents who recognize the decisions that are in front of them and are careful about them. So, what is it your father's ultimately afraid of? Is he afraid that he will be malnourished? The child will be malnourished? Or is he afraid he wouldn't have the pleasure of foie gras? What is behind it? If you want to know what I think is behind it, and I don't know your father, I would think what's behind it is a refutation of the way he raised you. The ways that we eat and feed each other are so central to life. And I think it's part of why there's so much anxiety around other choices, because we feel that they can't help but reflect on the choices that we make and challenge us. And so if you're saying, this is a huge value to me, and I want to, the most central fundamental relationship I have with my child, which is food, I'm going to do it in a way that is antithetical to how you did it with me, is probably a difficult thing to hear. But there's another way of looking at it, which is, you fed me what you fed me, and I'll feed my child what I feed my child, but it's going to be for the same reasons. The things that you instilled in me were not calories of any particular sort. They were a certain way of looking at the world and thinking about the world and being an individual in the world. And it's because of those lessons, even if I reach different conclusions, that I will do what I do. So I think there's certainly a way to have the conversation that doesn't have to feel... There is a way of shifting confrontation into agreement really easily. It's only a degree or two off. But it requires getting at what's behind the conversation, which ultimately isn't hamburger or not hamburger. It's how do we be careful? How can we be the most careful, thoughtful individuals in the world?
Thank you.
Thank you. So, you guys have a few things to say, right? Okay. Thank you very much.
All right, well, again, we would like to thank Mr. Jonathan Safran Foer for being here. In return for both your amazing literature as well as your amazing talk, we actually have T-shirts for you and a Yeah, yes, I know, free t-shirts at Duke. But we also have an even smaller one for your son. You know, early brand placement.
Thank you.
So that concludes our conversation today. Again, thank you very much for being here. I hope you had a wonderful time. All of the questions that you had, feel free to share those with each other. You know, you're getting ready to go off into your sections with your facts, and that's a great place to begin, and we will start dismissing you momentarily.
All right, everybody, can we give Mr. Jonathan Safran Foer one more round of applause? All right, so that this doesn't turn into chaos more than organized chaos, we're going to go ahead and dismiss you guys, facts and first years, by dorm. So if you would be patient with me and bear with me for a few minutes, we're going to go ahead and start with ACOC.
We should do Pegram next because that's where I lived. Can you
Okay,
handle that?
I can handle that. I can handle that.
Okay.
Do you want to go grab those books while I'm dismissing?
Yes.